So, this is part two of our lecture. We're going to look at the American side, what's going on the home front. Woodrow Wilson is president. He had defeated Taft and Roosevelt in the previous election. He chooses a course of neutrality, and this is important because public opinion on both sides are very high. Our relationship with Great Britain had actually improved quite a bit over the last few years, but we had a lot of German immigrants. So Wilson really thought that neutrality was the best course of action. He in fact said that we must be neutral in thought, word, and deed. Now, while the official position of the United States government was to be neutral, this didn't stop people from having very heated opinions about it. Wilson really thought the best thing to do would be for us to stay out of the war. Now, what we are concerned about is how will the war affect trade? What do we do? Do we trade with both sides? Do we trade with one side? Do we trade with none? Wilson is going to kind of try to stop commerce with everyone. He will actually ban bank loans to fighting countries because he thought it would bring a quick end to the war. That ban will be lifted in 1915 because we were afraid that lack of economic activity would actually lead to a recession. Now, so technically now banks in America could loan to both sides, but most of the money went to the Allies, especially the British. We loaned the British on average $10 million a day. Loans to Germany dropped to 1% of what they had been before the war. Now, trade with Germany was going to be very difficult because of the British blockade. But we also began to see German stories about atrocities that they had committed in Belgium. So, public opinion is very much kind of turning against the Germans. And honestly, as more and more people began to support the British, this upset our Irish and German immigrants. Now, eventually, it's going to be the war in the ocean that affects the United States. The British blockade, really hurt American trade. American ships to Germany were stopped and seized for contraband. In 1915, they added food and medicine to the list of contraband that they would not allow to go to Germany. This was actually a violation of international law. You can't stop people from giving you food and medicine. In March of 1915, Wilson protested the British blockade policy. The British said, well, I tell you what, why don't we give you some business? Why don't we buy some more American cotton? Would that make you feel better? And America's like, yeah, that sounds great. We'll drop this for now. Wilson is also becoming upset with German U-boats in the North Atlantic. Now, the U-boats were probably the Germans' greatest advantage in this war. These are submarines. And the way they work is basically they sneak up with from somebody, they fire their torpedoes, and they sink a ship. Now, according to international law, before a U-boat attacks, it's supposed to give warning, and it's supposed to make sure that it is not sinking a neutral ship. Well, the problem with giving warning is once you give the warning, if it's a warship, it knows where you are, and it blows you up. So giving a warning doesn't really work. On May 7th, 1915, a U-boat sinks the Lusitania. This is a British liner, but there are Americans on board. Wilson demanded reparations, and they demanded that all sides accept American right to travel the sea. Germany had actually put a warning in the newspapers on the East Coast. If you actually go back to Newsbank and you look through microfiche or whatever of old newspapers, you can actually find these advertisements that basically the German government said, we are warning you, we consider the North Atlantic a war zone, and we will fire on any ships that we find there. This was not good enough. This will eventually lead us to conflict. Wilson wanted all neutral nations to have the right to travel freely across the ocean. And eventually the Germans will actually give in on this. Interesting thing about the Lusitania, it was actually probably smuggling weapons to the British. William Jennings Bryan, who we've talked about, wanted to ban U.S. travel to the war zone. This was refused. He actually resigned his position. In August of 1915, the Germans sank a ship called the Arabic, killing 2 Americans. On September 1st, 1915, Germany issued what was called the Arabic Pledge, that said they would no longer sink passenger liners without warning. They also renounced attacks on merchant ships, and this was good enough to avoid war with the United States for now. Now, in the United States at this time, some groups began to call for military training for all men of a certain age. Progressives did not like this idea, because they thought that this would lead to a more militaristic society. Wilson, for his part, is actually running for re-election while all of this is happening. Wilson will actually win re-election in 1960 on a platform of he kept us out of war. This is actually not something that Wilson wanted to run on, because he really kind of thought that we'd eventually get involved in this war. He won the election on the idea of preparedness. He wins the Electoral College 277 to 254, so it's a relatively close race. From 1914 to 1917, the Germans decided that the best course of action to keep America out of the war was to keep America busy. So from 14 to 17, the Germans spent $12 million to support rebels in Mexico, including Francisco Pancho Villa, V-I-L-L-A. In 1916, with German support and financial support, he began attacking American border towns. One reason that Villa does this is to actually hurt the U.S.-supported government of Mexico. Wilson, for his part, sent 12,000 troops under Black Jack Pershing, P-E-R-S-H-I-N-G, to arrest Villa. They clashed with Villa's forces at a place called Carazal, on June 21st, 1916. Wilson then prepared for war with Mexico until he found out that Americans had actually shot first. Much like Han Solo had shot first in the Star Wars movie. I don't care what your re-edit says, George. So after that, the United States began negotiating, and American troops left Mexico in January of 1917. This allowed us to turn our attention back to Europe. And in January 22nd, 1917, we began to outline a peace settlement. We called it Peace Without Victory, based on American principles. We wanted to export democracy overseas and to expand our imperial reach. This, however, had very little effect on the fighting. Germany decided to go back to unrestricted warfare, and this forces U.S. neutrality to end, and the United States will enter the war. We began deliberations on entering the war on February of 1917. Now, before we talk about America really getting involved in the war, we should probably talk about Germany's decision to go back to unrestricted submarine warfare. The problem was that announcing yourself wasn't working. They were getting a lot of boats blown up. And William II is going to be convinced by one of his admirals that they actually have to do this or they're not going to win the war. When William II asked about American intervention, his advisors basically told him America would be too unorganized. There's no way they could get here in time, and even if they did, we would sink them all. In fact, an Admiral Hosendorf actually said, "I give your majesty my word as an officer that not one American will land on the continent." Now, this proved to be false. What we used was the convoy system, and we were able to get our ships across the Atlantic, and we will play a relatively pivotal part of the war in 1917. So we began deliberating on war in February of 1917. In mid-February, we learned of something called the Zimmermann telegram, Z-I-M-M-E-R-M-A-N, Z-I-M-M-E-R-M-A-N. The Zimmermann telegram, given to us by our good friends in British intelligence, basically was a cable between Germany and Mexico. Germany offered Mexico help in retaking Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona if they would start a border war to keep us out of the war. They also said that they would, like Mexico do, mediate their disputes between Japan and Germany. And they also wanted Japan to attack the United States in the Pacific, something that they would do years later. The president of Mexico, however, did not want to fight the United States. He had a very good relationship with the country. So nothing really came of this. But the British deciphered the Zimmermann telegraph, and the State Department made it public. Now, anti-war people in this country, because we love good conspiracy, said that this was a forgery. But it was enough to cause Wilson to cut off diplomatic ties with Germany. Germany began sinking 500,000 tons of Allied shipping each month. And finally, on April 12, 1917, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war. And we began to lay out our reasons for fighting. We basically are going to say that, I had a quote here. Oh, here we are. Wilson went before Congress April 2nd, 1917. He said, "We are glad now that we see the facts to fight thus for the ultimate peace of the world and for the liberation of its people, for the rights of nations, great and small, and the privilege of men everywhere to choose their way of life of obedience." So Wilson's saying, we're not fighting for territory. It's about America and apple pie and freedom, and letting people do what they want to do. And in Europe, they're basically fighting to gain land. So, we're trying to put a more ideological bent on this war to make it look like it's really worth fighting. If we're just killing each other over a few kilometers or miles of land, frankly, it's not a good cause. But if we can kind of say it's about freedom and letting people decide their own lives, then people can kind of get behind that. So, Wilson asked for the declaration of the war. The vote is 90-6 in the Senate and 373-50 in the House. Not everyone was gung-ho. Senator George Norris called this a rich man's war but a poor man's fight, which seems to often be true of the war. The first woman in Congress, a woman named Jeannette Rankin, will vote against the war. She will then lose her seat in 1918. Ironically, she will be re-elected again in 1914, where she will once again vote against war. So she has a very interesting career. As soon as war is declared, most Americans rally behind the war effort, and we're basically united in this war. Wilson said that we are fighting for idealistic reasons. He will put forth this in a speech called the 14 Points. He will also use this as the basis for what he tries to get after the war as a peace treaty. I've given you the handout, the 14 points. Make sure you read them, understand them. But basically they were saying that we would set up a League of Nations, we would respect neutrality of the seas, we would respect the territorial integrity of small countries, and basically only keep armaments that are necessary for the defense of a nation. But you'll have the 14 points, you can read those. American involvement comes at a very good time. Tsarist Russia had collapsed in February of 1917 in the Bolshevik Revolution, where Vladimir Lenin comes to power, where he published secret treaties embarrassing all nations of Europe. That's actually one of the reasons why Wilson put out his 14 points, because the treaties that Lenin published made it very clear that it was all about territory and gain, and secrecy, and so Wilson wants to push back against that. One of the 14 points is actually no more secret treaties. Lenin will actually send Trotsky to negotiate the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which actually officially ends Russia's time in the war, giving Germany a great deal of territory. Neither side planned to actually follow through on it. Russians and Germans do not get along. Neither side was going to respect the treaty, but it was pretty harsh for Russia. But Russia wanted out of the war. That's one of the things the Bolsheviks had promised. Plus, for Lenin, it didn't really matter because they were communists based on Marx, and they thought the worldwide revolution was imminent, so borders didn't really matter anymore. But Russia's out of the war. America coming is very important. Wilson also knew that Germany had to be weakened militarily. Germany is being worn down. They'll have to prepare for one last great offensive. Now, before we talk about the last bit of the war, I want to talk about what's going on the home front. Basically, when you go to total war, you got to turn your economy and everything toward war. And many thought that Wilson could use this opportunity to rein in big business. And Wilson was afraid that business could become even more powerful if they're not careful. He was able to increase wages, and he gave federal protection to the unions. Unfortunately for workers, these changes are not permanent. They're only in place while government contracts are in place. In the winter of 1917, the railroad system was paralyzed with blizzards, fuel shortages, and the poor conditions of the tracks. Private companies were not spending the money to fix them. It prevented the delivery of war-related freight. There was also labor unrest. In fact, one problem is many skilled railroad workers actually left for higher-paying factory jobs. Railway unions prepared for a strike. The federal government said, "We can't have you doing this," and they actually took over the management of the railroad for the rest of the war. The railroad administration gave workers higher wages, they standardized equipment, and coordinated the use of trains. Unfortunately, this won't last until after the war, and really they'll leave the system in worse shape than when they found it. They also created the War Industries Board, the WIB, which prioritized industries to make sure that the things needed for the war effort would be made. They paid railroad companies very well for the use of their railroads. But wartime traffic, as I mentioned, really destroyed what was left of the railroads. Herbert Hoover, a name that we'll talk about more next lecture, was the Food Administration Director, and he did a really good job of using high prices and patriotism to make sure there was enough food for everybody. In fact, after the war, he'll go to Europe, part of the Red Cross. He will help feed Europe, which is why I was so disappointed so many people how poorly he did with the Great Depression. He did organize propaganda campaigns to preserve food. Both business and labor did very well during the war, but after the war everything goes back to the status quo. This is also a time where 500,000 African Americans have migrated from the south to the north, and there were fears of racial riots. A lot had gone to the north because that's where the factories were. Women also fought for the right to vote. That will culminate in the 19th Amendment. In 1917, the government will pass the Espionage Act, which said that you could not obstruct military recruitment. This was possibly unconstitutional, but there were anti-war protesters trying to stop people from signing up. They also passed the Sedition Act of 1918 that said there could be no disloyal language during the war. Surprisingly, that was actually upheld by the Supreme Court. They cited if there's a clear and present danger, the government can inhibit free speech. This is where you get that quote, "You're not allowed to yell fire in a crowded theater if there's not a fire." Some German Americans will be attacked. There will be instances of Germans being beaten and tarred and feathered. Your book has some actual pictures of that. Now, what Wilson had to figure out was how to raise an army. And the truth is, waiting for volunteers was not going to work. So to raise an army, Wilson went with conscription. And then you could decide who worked in the war industries and who went off to war. We called the draft selective service. We still have that today. Men, when they turn 18, still are legally required to sign up for selective services. All men were required to register on June 5th, 1917. And 3 million men refused to do so. Many of them actually went to jail. Now, you could be a conscientious objector if you belong to a pacifist religion, and you could get out of military service that way. However, the best example of that was a Tennessean named Alvin York, who eventually agrees to fight, and like 80% of other conscientious objectors actually went to war. York is very famous. He has his house over in Crossville. They did a very long movie about him, I think in the 60s or 70s. If you're interested in Alvin York, check it out. It's a pretty good movie. It's a bit of a propaganda piece, really. It's got patriotism and religion in there. Conscripts will make up 72% of the U.S. Army. 20% of draft age males served in the military, making up 15% of the total adult male population. We had to quickly create training camps throughout the country. 18% of our Army, 1 in 5 thereabouts, were actually foreign born. 12,000 Native Americans served, 25% of the Native American population. 16,000 women went as nurses, telephone workers, and other support positions. African Americans will make up 13% of the military when they were 10% of the population, yet the Army was segregated. 89% of African American troops were labor troops under white officers. They built roads and bridges, and this was very important work. They found a more racially tolerant atmosphere in France. In fact, a lot of white Americans didn't like the fact that African Americans were treated like human beings in France. It bothered them. This led to a fear of a post-war race riots. And the civil rights movement does kind of get kick-started, not necessarily after World War I, but, you know, the things are set in motion, and then after World War II you really see it. Many actually African-American veterans will actually join post-war civil rights groups, so, you know, there is that. Government bureaucracy will have to step in. Psychologists will actually administer what they called intelligence tests to assign jobs in the military. 25% of our military had to take the test for illiterates. Now, what they said is these tests, and you have examples of this in your book, so really check it out, is basically they gave these intelligence tests and they gave people a mental age. They said that white soldiers had a mental age of 13, Russians were of the mental age of 11.34, Italians 11.01, Poles 10.74, that's the Polish, and African Americans were 10.41. Now, what this actually did, this was not really an intelligence test, it really showed the level of education each of these soldiers had. And frankly, it's kind of racist, the test. But that's how we got ready for war. So Americans will fight on the Western Front. Russia is already out of the war. The Germans had transferred over 1 million men from the Eastern Front for one last push in the West. In March of 1918, the Germans broke the trench stalemate and began moving toward Paris. They moved quickly, exhausting their troops, and they outran their supply lines. The American Expeditionary Forces under the AEF under General Blackjack John J. Pershing, Pershing, helped to stop the German advance. In July, we fought with the French on a 6-week counteroffensive before we finally settled into trench warfare. We would spend 21 days in the trench, a week to recuperate in the rear. That's how we went through the system. We were kind of the last soldiers to kind of realize how stupid it was. American soldiers would normally spend the day trying to avoid snipers, and they had to deal with giant rats and fleas and other terrible things. Rain would create mud. It's just a terrible thing. They had to deal with daily bombardments. In 1918, 1 out of every 4 shells contained poison gas. 1918, if it wasn't bad enough, that was a year of a great flu epidemic. It'll be called the Spanish flu, but it actually began in the Midwest of the United States, and American soldiers will actually take it to France. 25 million Americans will become sick. 675,000 Americans will die. 675,000 Americans will die from the flu. 1 million soldiers were sick. Even Woodrow Wilson caught the flu. It could strike suddenly. Fortunately, by 1919, the flu had run its course, but worldwide it had actually killed 30 million people. So that's all happening while the war is going on too. In September of 1918, we began to weaken German defenses, and we began to hit the Germans hard. We had casualties of 22,550 a day. 6,000 Americans died each week. Finally, we kept moving on. American convoys got around the U-boats, and eventually, after the Battle of the Bulge, Germany is lost. The war officially comes to an end on November 11th, 1918 at 11 a.m. That's when the armistice took place. If for a long time was Armistice Day, in England it is Remembrance Day. Today we have it as Veterans Day. Here are some numbers. 1.3 million French died. 722,000 British died. Germany had a casualty rate of 1.8 million. And 116,516 Americans will be killed during World War I, which will be more than those killed in Vietnam and Korea. What this will lead to is the Paris Peace Conference. This is an interesting thing because Woodrow Wilson himself will decide to go. The big three at the conference will be Woodrow Wilson, Clemenceau, the President of France, and David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Wilson wants to go in with the 14 points. He wants to create a League of Nations. But most of the people actually at the conference were, especially the British and French, really wanted to punish the Germans for starting this war. Wilson was able to make some compromises, and the ultimate thing to come out of this will be the Treaty of Versailles. Now, Wilson actually makes a political mistake. He doesn't take any Republicans with him, so he's going to face a great deal of backlash when he gets home. However, the Paris Peace Conference is actually a very interesting thing. There's a book called Paris 1919. I think it's Margaret Mead that wrote it, that really gets into that. So the Treaty of Versailles comes out of this. Wilson wants to go with the 14 points, open covenants of peace openly arrived at, self-determination for all groups. The big specter in the room, even though they weren't invited, was Russia, because they were now communists, so they were kind of a nation outside of polite nations, you know, so they were not invited. One concern that we had was that the Russians would try to conquer the rest of Europe, so that played a part in how large Eastern European nations ended up becoming because of the Treaty of Versailles. It led to a great deal of fear, and there will actually be upheavals and revolution, especially in Eastern Europe after World War One. And we actually will allow Germany to keep some armaments, because there was kind of a feeling that the Germans would kind of be the first line of defense against the Russian incursion. So Wilson's there. He decides to go to Paris himself, which is very strange for the time. And he wants his 14 points. He wants an idealistic peace. David Lloyd George and Clemenceau want to make sure Germany can never do what they did again. Wilson was very popular in France, but it didn't really help him. The negotiation table. What France and England want is a demilitarized Germany. They want Germany to pay reparations. They want a separate Rhineland as a buffer. Wilson did not like this, and one of the reasons was the fear of the Soviet Union. So eventually they do come to an agreement that that Germany's armaments will be severely reduced. They won't be allowed to have an air force. There will be a demilitarized zone next to France. France isn't particularly happy about this, but the British and Americans say they will sign a defensive pact with France, though the U.S. Senate will later reject that and the British will back out. What Wilson really wanted was the League of Nations, and he finally got that after making some compromises, especially on territories and what to do with Germany. Germany will be forced to pay reparations. It'll come up to be about 33 billion marks, which they will not be able to pay, especially when the Great Depression hits. So you get the Treaty of Versailles. It's actually 5 separate treaties for the 5 defeated nations. Austria, Germany, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. Now what actually happened was the victorious nations, which include the United States, Great Britain, Italy, France, Japan, and others, actually came and did the Treaty of Versailles before they even invited the defeated nations to come in. There's some wonderful discussions in that book I talked about. In fact, Japan actually wanted a clause about racial equality that Wilson actually tables. But it's a good book, Paris 1919. So Germany comes in. They think it's going to be like every other time you have a treaty, you negotiate something. They were kind of shocked when they said, this is the treaty, sign it, or we're going to send troops over the border and we're going to finish the job. Germany was understandably upset. They, however, felt that they could not win the conflict, so they signed the treaty on June 28, 1919. They were very unhappy. They said that this treaty is too harsh. We would never do this to anybody, forgetting what they had done to the Russians. They were especially unhappy with Article 231, which was the war guilt clause that said Germany and Austria, Germany specifically in their treaty, was responsible for the war. They didn't like taking responsibility. Germany did have to reduce their army to 100,000, cut back their navy, and get rid of their air force. The land west and 30 miles east of the Rhine became a demilitarized zone where it was stripped of armaments and fortifications. The new German government, the Weimar Republic, reluctantly accepted the dictated peace. We'll see with the 20s, this government is going to be very unpopular. We had said toward the end of the war that we would not make peace with an autocratic government. So William II leaves, and they set up a provisional government, and then it is that government that actually surrendered, surprising the German people, because none of the fighting had actually been done in Germany. They had been told that they were winning. Next thing they know, their Kaiser is gone, and a new government has surrendered. So that's going to lead to some opportunities for people like Hitler to say, hey, we got really messed over in this last war. Our leaders stabbed us in the back, and we need to rebuild a greater Germany. The treaty was very harsh. One general looked at the treaty and said, "This is not a peace treaty. This is an armistice for 20 years," and he was about right. World War I comes to an end in a very bad way. It's going to make Germany and Austria and even Italy, who feels like they didn't get everything they deserved, they're going to be very upset, and it's going to lead us to World War II. As I mentioned, World War I was an extremely avoidable war. However, because we have World War I and because of the way the war comes to an end, it actually made World War II pretty much inevitable. Now, what we're going to talk about next time is we're going to talk about the 1920s in the United States. We'll talk a little bit about Europe, what's going on there, and start a discussion on the Great Depression period. If you got any questions, let me know. Email me, leave me a comment, text me, whatever. I hope that you have a wonderful spring break, and I will see you guys when you get back. I apologize for the quality of this lecture. I'm not exactly technologically savvy, but hopefully this will be good enough. If you do have questions, let me know. If you're interested in a more of a look at the battles of war, there's a website called mapsofwar.com, M-A-P-S of war.com, and it has a kind of a slideshow of what was going on with World War I. Again, thanks for your attention, and I will see you after spring break.